March 3, 1943 dawned cold and gray over Port Moresby, New Guinea, where a maverick officer named Paul Irvin Gunn stood before a battered B-25 Mitchell bomber, sketching modifications that would make seasoned aeronautical engineers shake their heads in disbelief. The 43-year-old former Navy pilot, now serving as a civilian technical advisor to the 5th Air Force, envisioned something no one had attempted before, transforming a medium bomber into a ship-killing gunship that could fly low, fast, and unleash devastating firepower at point-blank range. Gunn's hands moved frantically across his notepad, calculating angles and weight distributions that seemed to defy conventional aviation wisdom. He wanted to remove the bombardier's compartment entirely and replace it with 8 forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns. The standard B-25 carried defensive armament and dropped bombs from altitude. Gunn's version would become a flying destroyer, attacking enemy ships at masthead level with concentrated gunfire that could shred steel and ignite fuel tanks. The Pacific War had reached a critical juncture. Japanese convoys continued supplying their isolated garrisons across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands, and American commanders desperately needed a weapon that could stop these supply lines. Traditional high-altitude bombing proved woefully ineffective against maneuvering ships, with accuracy rates below 5%. Skip bombing, bouncing bombs across the water into ship hulls, showed promise but required pilots to fly dangerously close to heavily armed vessels. Major General George Churchill Kenny, commander of the 5th Air Force, had personally recruited Gunn months earlier, recognizing in this unconventional thinker someone who might solve problems that stumped academy-trained officers. Kenny himself was no stranger to innovation, having spent his career challenging military orthodoxy, but even he initially questioned whether Gunn's gunship concept could work. The engineering challenges seemed insurmountable. Adding 8 heavy machine guns to the nose would shift the aircraft's center of gravity forward, potentially making it unflyable. The additional weight of guns and ammunition would reduce range and speed, possibly making the modified bombers vulnerable to Japanese fighters. According to historical accounts documented in MacArthur's Air Force by Bill Yen, Gunn had already proven himself invaluable by improvising solutions to countless supply and maintenance problems in the Southwest Pacific Theater. But this project represented his most ambitious undertaking yet. He proposed not merely modifying 1 or 2 aircraft for testing, but converting entire squadrons into what he called commerce destroyers, a term borrowed from naval warfare that perfectly captured his vision of bombers hunting, shipping like submarines stalked convoys. The bomber gun examined that morning belonged to the 3rd Attack Group, one of several units operating against Japanese targets from primitive airstrips carved from New Guinea's jungle. Its original olive drab paint was faded and stained, its metal skin patched in dozens of places where tropical conditions and combat damage had taken their toll. To Gunn, however, it represented a blank canvas, raw material that could be transformed into something revolutionary. His modification plans went beyond simply adding guns. Gunn intended to install additional armor plating to protect pilots during low-level attacks, strengthen the nose section to handle the tremendous vibration of 8 machine guns firing simultaneously, and modify the ammunition feed systems to prevent jams during critical combat moments. He calculated that each modified aircraft would carry approximately 4,000 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition, enough for sustained firing runs against multiple targets. Standing beside Gunn that morning was Captain Edward Larner, an engineering officer who had initially dismissed the gunship concept as fantasy. Larner had graduated from MIT with degrees in aeronautical engineering and believed firmly in mathematical certainty. Yet here stood this self-taught mechanic proposing modifications that violated every principle Larner had learned. The two men represented a fundamental clash between institutional military thinking and battlefield improvisation, between theory and desperate necessity. "It'll never fly straight," Larner argued, gesturing at Gunn's sketches. "You're talking about adding nearly 1,000 pounds to the nose. The moment you fire those guns, the recoil will tear the nose section apart. And even if it holds together, no pilot will be able to control an aircraft that nose-heavy." Gunn's weathered face creased into a determined smile. He had heard similar objections from every credentialed engineer who examined his plans. But Gunn possessed something those academy-trained officers lacked: 15 years of practical experience maintaining and modifying aircraft in the most challenging conditions imaginable. He had barnstormed across the Philippines during the 1930s, keeping ancient biplanes flying with improvised parts and sheer ingenuity. He understood how aircraft actually behaved, not just how equations predicted they should behave. The math works if you account for the modifications as a system, Gunn explained patiently. We'll remove the bombardier equipment and greenhouse, saving weight forward. We'll relocate some fuel capacity aft to shift the center of gravity. The nose guns will be mounted on a reinforced frame that distributes stress across the entire forward fuselage, not just the nose cone. As for recoil, we'll stagger the firing sequence so not all 8 guns discharge simultaneously. Larner examined the calculations again, grudgingly admitting that Gunn's approach showed more sophistication than he had initially credited. But theory meant nothing without testing. General Kenny had authorized converting one B-25 as a proof of concept, and that aircraft now sat before them awaiting transformation. If the modifications failed, Gunn's gunship program would end before it truly began. The conversion work began immediately, with Gunn personally directing a team of maintenance crew drawn from the 3rd Bomb Group's limited personnel. These mechanics were mostly enlisted men who had learned their trade in civilian garages before the war, supplemented by a handful of specialists who had actually built aircraft in factories back home. They worked around the clock in oppressive heat and humidity, plagued by tropical insects and occasional Japanese air raids that sent everyone scrambling for shelter. Removing the bombardier's compartment proved straightforward. The entire transparent nose section unbolted cleanly. Installing the gun mounts required more ingenuity. Gunn had fabricated mounting brackets from salvaged materials, including steel plate from damaged aircraft and bolts scavenged from destroyed Japanese equipment. Each .50 caliber machine gun weighed 84 pounds, and the mounts needed to absorb recoil forces while maintaining accurate alignment. Gunn insisted on test firing each gun individually on the ground before installation, ensuring perfect mechanical function. The ammunition feed system presented the greatest technical challenge. Standard B-25 defensive guns fired intermittently, but Gunn's nose battery would sustain fire for extended periods during attack runs. The original ammunition boxes and feed chutes couldn't handle the volume of rounds flowing through the system. Gunn designed enlarged ammunition containers and reinforced feed mechanisms, borrowing concepts from Navy fighter aircraft he had maintained years earlier. He installed redundant systems wherever possible, reasoning that combat damage might disable individual guns but shouldn't silence the entire battery. While mechanics sweated over the prototype, Gunn worked simultaneously on tactical doctrine. He consulted with experienced B-25 pilots, learning how the aircraft handled at low altitude and high speed. He studied Japanese ship construction, identifying vulnerable points where concentrated machine gun fire would cause maximum damage. He calculated optimal attack angles and ranges, determining that firing runs should begin at approximately 1,000 yards and continue until the aircraft passed directly over the target at masthead height, sometimes as low as 50 feet above the water. April 10, 1943 arrived with the crystal-clear skies that made New Guinea's weather both beautiful and treacherous. Perfect visibility meant Japanese reconnaissance aircraft might spot American airfields and trigger retaliatory strikes. But the weather also provided ideal conditions for testing Gunn's prototype gunship, which now sat on the Port Moresby runway with its radically altered profile, drawing curious stares from every pilot and mechanic on the base. Major Edward Larner, who had transitioned from skeptic to cautious supporter, volunteered to fly the test mission. He had piloted B-25s for 18 months and understood the aircraft's handling characteristics intimately. If anyone could evaluate whether Gunn's modifications compromised flight safety, Larner was that pilot. Gunn would fly in the co-pilot seat, accompanied by a skeleton crew of 3 gunners and a flight engineer. The modified bomber's nose looked predatory, with 8 machine gun barrels protruding from what resembled a flattened snout. Ground crew had painted shark teeth around the gun ports, a touch of psychological warfare borrowed from the American volunteer group in China. The rest of the aircraft retained its worn camouflage paint, though Gunn had insisted on fresh markings identifying it as B-25G-1, the prototype for what he hoped would become an entire variant. Larner advanced the throttles, feeling the right Cyclone engines roar to life with their familiar deep-throated growl. The bomber rolled forward, accelerating down the coral-surfaced runway that Army engineers had carved from jungle just months earlier. Gunn watched the airspeed indicator climb, 50 knots, 60, 70, as the runway blurred beneath them. At 85 knots, Larner eased back on the control yoke, expecting the nose-heavy aircraft to resist rotation. To his surprise, the bomber lifted smoothly, climbing at a normal angle with no tendency to drop its nose. Gunn's careful calculations had worked. The center of gravity modifications compensated for the additional forward weight, and the aircraft handled almost identically to a standard B-25. Larner banked left, heading out over the Solomon Sea where they could conduct gunnery tests away from friendly shipping. At 3,000 feet, Larner leveled off and activated the intercom. "Ready for test firing?" he asked. "Affirmative," Gunn responded, his voice tight with anticipation. This moment would determine whether months of work had produced a viable weapon or an expensive failure. He checked the gun charging handles, ensuring all 8 weapons were ready to fire. Commencing test in 3, 2, 1, Gunn pressed both thumb triggers simultaneously. The noise was apocalyptic. 850 caliber machine guns erupted in a deafening roar that shook the entire aircraft. Tracer rounds streaked ahead in a solid stream of fire, converging at the point where Gunn had aimed, approximately 800 yards distant. The recoil pushed against the airframe, causing slight vibration, but nothing that threatened structural integrity. Ammunition belts fed smoothly through the mechanisms, brass casings ejecting in golden streams that fell toward the sea below. Gunn held the triggers down for 5 seconds, expending nearly 300 rounds. When he released, silence returned suddenly, broken only by the drone of engines and the ringing in everyone's ears. He glanced at Larner, whose wide eyes reflected the same thought. This weapon exceeded even optimistic expectations. The concentrated firepower was devastating, far beyond anything either man had experienced. "Again," Larner commanded, his engineering mind now fully convinced. "Let's see if it remains stable through sustained firing." The successful test flight electrified 5th Air Force headquarters. General Kenny immediately authorized converting 12 additional B-25s to Gunn's specifications, forming what would officially become the 3rd Attack Group's Strafer Squadron. The term strafer emerged naturally, borrowed from German wartime vocabulary, but perfectly describing these aircraft's mission: attacking ground and sea targets at minimum altitude with concentrated machine gun fire. By late May 1943, Gunn had perfected his modification process, reducing conversion time from 3 weeks to just 8 days per aircraft. His team had established a production line of sorts at Port Moresby, with specialized stations handling different aspects of the conversion. One crew removed bombardier equipment and installed gun mounts. Another group handled ammunition systems. A third focused on electrical modifications needed to power and control 8 forward guns. Gunn moved constantly between workstations, troubleshooting problems and implementing improvements based on lessons learned from each completed aircraft. The pilots selected for strafer training represented the 3rd Attack Group's most experienced and aggressive flyers. They included men like Captain Ralph Deloach, who had already earned the Distinguished Flying Cross for low-level attacks against Japanese shipping, and Lieutenant Donald Dickerson, known for his exceptional gunnery skills. These pilots understood that Gunn's gunships would require flying directly into enemy defensive fire, maintaining steady courses while ships threw up walls of anti-aircraft tracers. Only pilots with ice-cold nerves and absolute confidence in their aircraft could succeed in such missions. Training began over the Solomon Sea, with strafers attacking abandoned Japanese barges and small coastal vessels that American forces had captured or destroyed in previous engagements. The pilots learned to approach targets at wave-top height, using the Earth's curvature to avoid detection until the last possible moment. At 1,000 yards, they would initiate firing runs, walking their tracer streams onto targets, while closing at nearly 300 miles per hour. The noise inside the cockpit during firing was indescribable. 8 heavy machine guns created a thunderous roar that made communication nearly impossible despite headsets. According to documentation preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, as referenced in William Wolfe's 5th Air Force in World War II, Gunn spent countless hours refining attack tactics during these training missions. He discovered that staggering gun firing in pairs rather than volleys reduced airframe stress while maintaining nearly continuous fire on target. He developed specific aiming techniques that accounted for bullet drop and convergence at various ranges. Most importantly, he taught pilots to concentrate fire at the waterline of target vessels, where machine gun rounds could penetrate thin hull plating and reach vital spaces below decks. The ammunition selected for these missions reflected Gunn's thorough understanding of ballistics and target effects. Each gun's ammunition belt included a mixture of armor-piercing incendiary rounds, standard ball ammunition, and tracers. The armor-piercing incendiary bullets could penetrate light armor and ignite fuel or ammunition, while tracers allowed pilots to observe bullet trajectories and adjust their aim. Gunn calculated that a 5-second burst from all 8 guns would put over 300 rounds into a target area roughly 30 feet square, enough firepower to disable most vessels smaller than a destroyer. By early June, the Strafer Squadron had achieved operational readiness. 12 modified B-25s sat dispersed around Port Moresby's airfield, camouflaged under palm fronds and awaiting the mission that would prove their worth. Intelligence officers monitored Japanese shipping movements carefully, searching for an opportunity to demonstrate the Strafer's capabilities. They didn't have to wait long. June 28, 1943, brought urgent intelligence reports to General Kenny's headquarters. Allied coast watchers, brave Australian and native scouts operating behind Japanese lines, had spotted a major enemy convoy forming near Rabaul, the heavily fortified Japanese base on New Britain Island. The convoy reportedly included at least 20 vessels, cargo ships carrying supplies and reinforcements, tankers loaded with aviation fuel, and destroyer escorts providing protection. This fleet would sail toward Lae, a critical Japanese stronghold on New Guinea's northern coast, following a route that took them through the Bismarck Sea. Kenny recognized this as the perfect opportunity to unleash Gunn's strafers against a high-value target. He summoned Gunn and the 3rd Attack Group's commander, Colonel Donald Hall, for an immediate planning session. Maps were spread across a conference table, showing the convoy's projected route and timing. Weather forecasts predicted scattered clouds and moderate seas, acceptable conditions for low-level attack, though not ideal. "Paul, this is what we've prepared for," Kenny said, stabbing a finger at the map. "Your strafers get first crack at this convoy. I want those cargo ships at the bottom of the Bismarck Sea, and I want the world to know what your gunships can do." Gunn studied the map carefully, his experienced eyes calculating distances, fuel requirements, and timing. The convoy would be approximately 400 miles from Port Moresby when positioned for attack, well within the modified B-25's range, with fuel reserves for combat and the return flight. Intelligence estimated the convoy would steam at 12 knots, a relatively slow speed that reflected the cargo vessel's limitations. Japanese destroyer escorts would provide anti-aircraft fire, but gun strafers would approach too low and too fast for traditional anti-aircraft gunnery to track effectively. "We'll need fighter escort," Gunn observed. "Once we make our initial pass, those destroyers will be alerted and their fighters from Rabaul will scramble. I'm confident the strafers can survive 1 run, maybe 2, but will be vulnerable during the return flight." Kenny nodded. "I'll give you every P-38 available. They'll sweep ahead, establish air superiority, and cover your withdrawal. But understand, Paul, this mission is optional only in the sense that I won't order unwilling pilots to fly it. The risks are substantial. We're sending you against the most heavily defended convoy the Japanese have assembled in months." Colonel Hall spoke up, his voice firm. "General, every pilot in the 3rd Attack Group has volunteered. They've trained for this. They believe in what Captain Gunn has built. We're ready." Planning continued through the night. Gunn worked with his most experienced pilots, developing attack formations and tactics. The strafers would approach in a loose line-abreast formation, spacing themselves to avoid concentration of defensive fire while ensuring multiple targets could be engaged simultaneously. Each pilot would select a target independently, attacking cargo vessels first, and leaving destroyers for follow-up strikes only if ammunition remained. The mission would launch at dawn on June 30th, timing their arrival over the convoy for mid-morning when visibility would be optimal, but the sun's angle wouldn't blind pilots during their approach. 12 strafers would participate, supported by 16 P-38 fighters from the 49th Fighter Group. Conventional B-25s carrying bombs would attack simultaneously from medium altitude, creating confusion and dividing Japanese defensive attention. As dawn approached on June 30th, ground crews swarmed over the strafers conducting final pre-flight inspections. Ammunition handlers loaded 4,000 rounds per aircraft, approximately 3 minutes of sustained firing if pilots held triggers continuously, though tactics called for shorter, controlled bursts. Fuel tanks were topped off. Engines started and warmed up carefully. Pilots gathered for a final briefing, their faces showing the tension every combat aviator experiences before a major mission. Gunn addressed them quietly, without dramatics or false optimism. You've trained for this mission. You know your aircraft and their capabilities. Remember your tactics. Approach low, commence firing at 1,000 yards, maintain steady course until you pass over target, then brake hard left. Don't fixate on a single target. If you get hits, move to the next ship. The objective is sinking tonnage, not perfecting your aim on one vessel. And remember, those Japanese sailors are doing their duty just as we're doing ours. Make it quick and professional. The 12 strafers roared down Port Moresby's runway at precisely 0600 hours, lifting off in pairs and circling to form up over the airfield. Dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of gold and crimson, a beautiful morning that seemed to mock the deadly business ahead. Gunn flew in the lead aircraft piloted by Captain DeLoach, with Lieutenant Dickerson's strafer tucked in close on their right wing. The formation climbed to 5,000 feet for the transit flight, conserving fuel and staying above the worst of the tropical heat rising from New Guinea's jungle. 38 fighters wove above and ahead, their distinctive twin-boom silhouettes unmistakable against the brightening sky. These long-range fighters carried drop tanks for extended patrol time, and their pilots were veterans of countless air battles over New Guinea and the Solomons. They would sweep ahead of the strafers, clearing any Japanese fighters from the area and ensuring the bombers could make their attack runs without interference from above. The flight across the Solomon Sea took nearly 2 hours. Pilots maintained radio silence, communicating only through hand signals and wing movements. Gunn used the time to review attack plans mentally, visualizing the approach, the firing run, the breakaway. He had flown countless combat missions during his career, but this one carried special weight. If the strafers failed, if his modifications proved ineffective against a defended convoy, the entire program would be discredited. Months of work and the faith General Kenny had placed in an unorthodox civilian advisor would be wasted. At 0830 hours, the P-38 flight leader radioed back. Bandits ahead bearing 340, Angels 10, were engaging. The fighters accelerated away, dropping their external tanks and climbing to intercept Japanese fighters rising from Rabaul to protect the convoy. Within minutes, the chatter of air combat filled the radio frequencies. Break left, break left. Got one smoking, 2 Zeeks on my 6. The desperate, clipped language of aerial combat. Gunn ignored the fighter battle playing out above and ahead. His focus narrowed to the task immediately before them. Captain DeLoach pushed the bomber's nose down, descending toward wavetop altitude. The other strafers followed, spreading into a line abreast formation spanning nearly a mile of ocean. At 200 feet, DeLoach leveled off, the B-25's shadow racing across the water barely below them. Target in sight, DeLoach announced calmly. Convoy at 12 o'clock, range 10 miles. Gunn strained forward, spotting the dark silhouettes of ships on the horizon. The Japanese convoy steamed in a standard defensive formation, cargo vessels in the center, destroyers positioned on the flanks and ahead. Even at this distance, Gunn could see the white wakes trailing each vessel. They hadn't yet reacted to the approaching strafers, probably assuming the low-flying aircraft were their own patrol planes returning from search missions. At 5 miles, the Japanese recognized the threat. Tracers began arcing upward from destroyer escorts, lazy-looking streams of light that accelerated as they approached. Anti-aircraft shells burst in black puffs ahead and above the strafers, the Japanese gunners not yet adjusted to the Americans' extremely low altitude. DeLoach held steady course, his jaw set in concentration, 1,000 yards. Gunn aligned the gun sight's crosshairs on a large cargo vessel, possibly 3,000 tons, its deck stacked with crates and equipment. His thumbs found the firing triggers. "Commencing attack run," he announced, and pressed both triggers simultaneously. The world exploded in noise and violence. 8 machine guns erupted in a continuous roar, their tracers reaching out in a solid stream of fire that converged on the target ship. Gunn watched his bullets walk up the vessel's hull, sparking against steel plating, shattering glass, tearing through superstructure. He held the triggers down, the gun sight remaining locked on target as Deloach maintained perfect course. Rounds struck the waterline, punching through thin hull plating into the cargo spaces beyond, 500 yards. The target ship grew enormous in the windscreen, its crew visible on deck, some firing rifles uselessly at the approaching bomber. Gunn could see individual impacts now, bullets tearing through lifeboats, shredding cargo netting, destroying deck equipment. A fire erupted amidships, orange flames billowing from a ruptured fuel drum. 200 yards separated Deloach's strafer from the cargo ship when Gunn finally released the triggers, having expended nearly 600 rounds. The bomber screamed directly over the vessel at masthead height, so low that Gunn could see the terror on Japanese sailors' faces as they dove for cover. Deloach yanked the control yoke hard left, banking the B-25 sharply to avoid collision with the ship's superstructure. The aircraft's right wingtip passed within feet of the cargo vessel's radio antenna. As they broke away, Gunn glanced back through the side window. The cargo ship was burning fiercely now, smoke pouring from multiple locations along its length. Sailors were abandoning ship, jumping into the sea as flames spread across the deck. But there was no time to observe results. Deloach was already lining up on a second target, a smaller coastal freighter attempting to maneuver away from the attacking strafers. All around them, the Bismarck Sea had transformed into a killing ground. 11 other strafers were making simultaneous attacks, their tracers creating a web of fire across the convoy formation. A tanker exploded spectacularly as armor-piercing incendiary rounds penetrated its cargo tanks, sending a mushroom of flame 500 feet into the air. Another cargo ship listed heavily to starboard, water flooding through dozens of machine gun-created holes below its waterline. A destroyer attempted to interpose itself between the strafers and a high-value target, its anti-aircraft guns blazing. But the low-flying bombers were moving too fast for the destroyer's gunners to track effectively. Gunn hammered the second freighter with a sustained burst, watching his tracers chew through the vessel's thin hull plating. These coastal freighters were designed for short runs between Pacific islands, built lightly to maximize cargo capacity. They had virtually no armor protection, making them vulnerable to weapons like Gunn's nose battery. The freighter's deck cargo, stacked drums of fuel or supplies, erupted in flames as incendiary rounds found flammable materials. Lieutenant Dickerson's strafer attacked a third cargo vessel simultaneously, his fire causing a secondary explosion that suggested he had hit an ammunition ship. The vessel simply disintegrated, torn apart by the detonation of its own cargo. Wreckage rained across hundreds of yards of ocean, and the shockwave was strong enough that Deloach felt it buffet his aircraft even at a quarter-mile distance. The Japanese destroyer escorts were fighting desperately, but ineffectively. Their anti-aircraft weapons were designed for high-altitude targets, with mechanical systems too slow to track aircraft approaching at wave-top level and 300 miles per hour. Some destroyers attempted to employ their main deck guns, firing at point-blank range, but coordinating such fire against multiple fast-moving targets proved impossible. A few strafers took hits. Gunn saw one aircraft trailing smoke from its left engine, but the modified bombers proved remarkably durable, their reinforced structures and added armor protection keeping them airborne, despite battle damage. The attack lasted approximately 7 minutes from first firing to the strafers' withdrawal. In that brief period, Gunn's gunships had fundamentally altered naval warfare in the Pacific. Traditional medium bombers attacked from altitude, releasing bombs that often missed maneuvering ships. Gunn's strafers flew directly into their targets, placing machine gun fire with rifle-like precision. The psychological impact on Japanese sailors was devastating, watching tracer streams tear apart their vessels while unable to effectively return fire. According to accounts compiled in the 5th Air Force story by Air Force historians, which references this engagement, Gunn himself expended approximately 1,800 rounds during 2 complete attack runs. His fire damaged or sank 3 vessels: the initial cargo ship that burned and eventually sank hours later, the coastal freighter that capsized from flooding, and a contribution to the destruction of the ammunition ship that Dickerson had attacked. As the strafers reformed and turned for home, Gunn counted hulls. 5 ships were definitely sinking, going down by the bow or listing so heavily they would never reach port. 3 more were burning fiercely enough that their survival seemed doubtful. 2 destroyers showed damage but remained operational. Several smaller vessels in the convoy's rear ranks appeared to have escaped without serious hits, probably because the strafers concentrated on high-value cargo carriers first. The P-38 fighters reported shooting down 6 Japanese fighters while losing one of their own, an acceptable exchange ratio. They formed up around the returning strafers, providing protective escort during the vulnerable flight home. One strafer had sustained engine damage severe enough that its pilot chose to ditch in the sea, within sight of the New Guinea coast, where rescue boats could retrieve the crew. The other 11 landed safely at Port Moresby, their gun barrels still hot from sustained firing. The intelligence officers who debriefed Gunn and the strafer crews that afternoon could barely contain their excitement. Preliminary damage assessments, based on pilot observations and coastwatcher reports, indicated that the strike had sunk or severely damaged at least 8 vessels totaling approximately 25,000 tons of Japanese shipping. Final confirmation would take days, as reconnaissance aircraft photographed the convoy's remnants and coast watchers observed vessels struggling back toward Rabaul or beaching themselves on nearby islands. General Kenny personally congratulated each strafer crew, shaking hands and presenting on-the-spot awards. But he also immediately began planning the next strike. The wounded convoy still contained viable targets, and Japanese rescue vessels would sortie from Rabaul to assist survivors. Those rescue ships represented additional opportunities for Gunn's gunships. July 1st dawned with the strafers again launching at dawn, this time targeting the convoy's surviving vessels and the rescue flotilla attempting to reach them. The Japanese were more prepared this time, having rushed additional fighter cover to the area and positioned their remaining destroyers for maximum defensive coverage. But preparation meant little against the strafers' overwhelming firepower. In a second devastating attack, Gunn's modified bombers sank another 4 cargo vessels and damaged 2 destroyers badly enough that they required towing back to Rabaul. The third strike came on July 2nd, targeting stragglers and damaged vessels trying to limp toward safety. By this time, Japanese fighter resistance had collapsed. Their Rabaul-based units had sustained heavy losses in the preceding day's battles, and surviving pilots were ordered to conserve their aircraft. The strafers attacked virtually unopposed, methodically hunting down and destroying the convoy's remnants. One cargo vessel attempted to beach itself on a small island, hoping to salvage its cargo, but strafers set it ablaze while it sat aground. By July 3rd, when reconnaissance aircraft surveyed the area, the destruction was total. Of the original 20-vessel convoy, only 3 ships, 2 destroyers, and 1 fast transport had reached Leh. 17 vessels had been sunk or destroyed, representing over 50,000 tons of Japanese shipping and incalculable quantities of supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements that would never reach their destination. The Japanese army garrison at Leh, already under pressure from Allied ground forces, would not receive the reinforcement and resupply it desperately needed. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, as historians would later name these engagements, represented a watershed moment in the Pacific War. Gunn's strafers had proven beyond doubt that low-level gunship attacks could devastate enemy shipping with far greater effectiveness than traditional bombing methods. The psychological impact extended beyond tactical success. Japanese commanders now understood that any convoy within range of 5th Air Force bases faced potential annihilation. Gunn's personal contribution during the 3 days of attacks was documented meticulously by 5th Air Force intelligence officers. Flying on all 6 strafer missions, he personally participated in attacks that sank or damaged 12 vessels. His modified B-25s, the aircraft that engineers had called impossible, had exceeded even optimistic expectations. The nose-mounted machine gun battery proved devastatingly effective against lightly armored vessels, and the structural modifications held up perfectly under combat conditions. General Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander of Allied Forces in the Southwest Pacific, personally commended Gunn's achievement in a communication referenced in official Army Air Forces records. MacArthur recognized that the Strafer victory had immediate strategic implications. Japanese shipping losses would directly impact their ability to sustain operations across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. The supply lines that kept isolated Japanese garrisons fed and armed were now under siege by a weapon they could barely counter. The success of Gunn's strafers triggered immediate changes across the 5th Air Force. General Kenny authorized the conversion of 75 additional B-25s to the strafer configuration, creating entire squadrons equipped with the modified bombers. Gunn found himself promoted to major and assigned full-time to oversee the strafer program's expansion. His small modification team at Port Moresby grew into a substantial operation, with specialized facilities and trained personnel dedicated to converting bombers. The original 8-gun configuration evolved rapidly based on combat experience. Gunn added 4 additional 50-caliber guns in side blisters, giving each strafer 12 forward-firing weapons capable of delivering over 800 rounds per minute onto target. Some aircraft received even heavier armament, with 75mm cannons replacing the lower nose guns. These variants could penetrate destroyer armor and proved devastating against larger vessels. Training programs expanded to prepare new strafer crews for the unique demands of low-level attack flying. The tactics Gunn had developed during those first combat missions became standardized doctrine, taught to every incoming pilot. Mock attacks against friendly vessels provided realistic training, with ship's crews learning valuable lessons about defending against strafer-style attacks. The symbiotic relationship between air and naval forces strengthened as both services adapted to this new form of warfare. The Japanese responded to the strafer threat with defensive innovations of their own. Convoys began sailing at night, hoping darkness would protect them from low-level attacks. They increased fighter escort allocation, dedicating entire squadrons to convoy protection duty. Ships received additional light anti-aircraft weapons, focusing on calibers effective against low-altitude targets. Some vessels deployed barrage balloons on cables, attempting to force strafers to higher altitudes where conventional anti-aircraft fire would be more effective. None of these countermeasures proved particularly effective. Gunn's strafers adapted to night sailing by attacking at dawn and dusk, when low sun angles made Japanese anti-aircraft gunnery nearly impossible. Fighter escorts could be countered by Allied fighters, and the strafers themselves proved capable of defending themselves. Their heavy nose armament could engage Japanese fighters head-on, a capability that surprised and intimidated enemy pilots. Barrage balloons were simply avoided or shot down during attack runs. The strafer program's influence extended beyond the immediate tactical success. Aircraft designers at companies like North American Aviation began incorporating lessons learned from Gunn's modifications into new aircraft designs. The A-26 Invader, which entered service in 1944, featured many strafer-inspired characteristics: heavy forward armament, reinforced structure, and optimized low-level performance. The B-25H variant, officially produced by North American Aviation, incorporated all of Gunn's modifications as factory-installed equipment rather than field modifications. Gunn continued flying combat missions throughout 1943 and into 1944, personally leading strafer formations against Japanese targets across New Guinea, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Philippines. His aircraft became recognizable to friend and enemy alike, painted with distinctive markings and carrying names like Commerce Destroyer that reflected his naval warfare conceptualization. Pilots in other squadrons volunteered for transfer to strafer units, specifically to fly under Gunn's command, recognizing that he combined technical brilliance with genuine concern for crew survival. The strategic impact of the strafer program on the Pacific War cannot be overstated. Japanese shipping losses accelerated dramatically during the latter half of 1943, with strafers accounting for a substantial percentage of tonnage sunk. Island garrisons that might have held out for months collapsed within weeks when supply lines were severed. The Japanese Army's ability to reinforce threatened positions deteriorated steadily as convoy after convoy was decimated by low-level attacks. August 11, 1944 brought tragedy. Major Paul Irvin Gunn, the maverick genius who had revolutionized air-sea warfare, was killed when his B-25 strafer was shot down during an attack on a Japanese convoy near Mindanao in the Philippines. He was 44 years old. The aircraft he had designed and perfected, the tactics he had developed and taught, and the combat philosophy he had championed would survive him. But his death left an irreplaceable void in the 5th Air Force. The circumstances of Gunn's final mission reflected the aggressive spirit that had defined his entire career. Intelligence had identified a high-value convoy carrying reinforcements to Japanese forces defending the Philippines. Despite dense cloud cover and deteriorating weather conditions, Gunn insisted on leading the strike personally. Eyewitness accounts from surviving crew members indicated that Gunn's aircraft took heavy anti-aircraft fire during its second attack run, with shells damaging the right engine and control surfaces. Rather than break off and attempt an emergency landing, Gunn pressed the attack, completing his firing run before his crippled bomber plunged into the sea. No survivors were recovered. General Kenny learned of Gunn's death while planning the air campaign for the upcoming Philippine invasion. The normally stoic commander was visibly shaken, later writing in his personal diary that the 5th Air Force had lost the most innovative and valuable air combat tactician in the Pacific Theater. Kenny immediately recommended Gunn for the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration, citing his extraordinary contributions to the war effort. The recommendation emphasized not just Gunn's combat record, but his revolutionary modifications that had fundamentally altered the nature of air-naval warfare. The Strafer program continued expanding even after Gunn's death, guided by the principles and procedures he had established. By war's end in 1945, over 200 B-25 aircraft had been converted to Strafer configuration, operating across the Pacific Theater from New Guinea to the Philippines to Okinawa. These aircraft accounted for hundreds of Japanese vessels sunk or damaged, thousands of tons of supplies destroyed, and incalculable disruption to enemy operations. The Strafer's success rate far exceeded that of conventional bombing, validating Gunn's belief that concentrated machine gun fire delivered at point-blank range represented the most effective anti-shipping weapon available to land-based aviation. Post-war analysis by military historians revealed the full scope of Gunn's achievement. During the 3-day Battle of the Bismarck Sea in June and July 1943, Strafers sank 12 vessels as initially reported, but the actual total proved even higher when Japanese records became available after the war. 14 vessels had been lost, with 3 more so badly damaged they never returned to service. The convoy's destruction had immediate strategic consequences, forcing cancellation of a planned Japanese offensive in New Guinea, and contributing to the eventual Allied recapture of that strategic territory. The technical innovations Gunn pioneered influenced aircraft design for decades after the war. The concept of forward-firing heavy armament on medium bombers became standard practice, incorporated into aircraft like the Douglas A-26 Invader and later the Martin B-57 Canberra. Modern ground attack aircraft like the Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt trace their conceptual lineage directly to Gunn's Strafers, aircraft designed to fly low, survive heavy fire, and deliver devastating weapons loads with precision. Gunn's family, his wife Polly and their 4 children, received his posthumous decorations in a ceremony at San Antonio, Texas, in December 1944. The Distinguished Service Cross citation read in part, Major Paul Gunn displayed extraordinary heroism and technical genius in developing and leading revolutionary low-level attack tactics that resulted in the destruction of enemy shipping valued at over 100,000 tons. His innovations saved countless American lives by interdicting enemy supply lines, and his personal courage inspired all who served with him. The Australian government, recognizing Gunn's contributions to the defense of their nation, posthumously awarded him membership in the Order of the British Empire. Australian coast watchers and military personnel who had worked with Gunn during his time in the Southwest Pacific testified to his dedication and effectiveness. One coast watcher reported that Gunn had personally flown supply missions to forward observation posts, risking his life to deliver medicine and equipment to isolated scouts operating behind Japanese lines. In 1946, the newly independent United States Air Force established the Paul Gunn Award, presented annually to the officer or airman who demonstrated exceptional innovation in combat aircraft modification or tactical development. The awards criteria explicitly referenced Gunn's willingness to challenge conventional thinking and his ability to transform theoretical concepts into practical battlefield capabilities. Recipients over subsequent decades included pioneers in jet propulsion, precision-guided weapons, and stealth technology, all following the trail that Gunn had blazed. The broader implications of Gunn's work extended beyond military aviation. His approach to problem-solving, identifying a critical need, developing an unconventional solution, and implementing it despite institutional resistance, became a case study taught at military academies and business schools. The Strafer program demonstrated how innovation could emerge from unexpected sources, how practical experience sometimes trumped theoretical knowledge, and how institutional flexibility could produce dramatic tactical advantages. Modern air forces continue employing Gunn's fundamental insight that concentrated firepower delivered precisely at low altitude can achieve effects far beyond what high-altitude bombing accomplishes. The AC-130 gunship, first deployed during the Vietnam War, represented a direct evolution of Gunn's Strafer concept, a transport aircraft converted into a flying weapons platform with side-firing cannons and machine guns. Contemporary gunships like the AC-130W carry vastly more sophisticated weapons, but their tactical employment mirrors principles Gunn established over the Bismarck Sea in 1943. The Strafer story also illuminated broader truths about warfare and innovation. Gunn succeeded because he combined multiple rare qualities: technical expertise, combat experience, creative thinking, and the courage to challenge authority when necessary. His modifications worked because he understood aircraft as complete systems rather than collections of components. His tactics succeeded because he approached problems from unconventional angles, borrowing concepts from naval warfare and applying them to aviation. Perhaps most significantly, Gunn's achievement demonstrated that revolutionary advances often come not from massive research programs or institutional initiatives, but from individual innovators willing to pursue their vision despite skepticism. The engineers who called his gunship impossible were working from established principles and conventional wisdom. Gunn succeeded by questioning those principles, testing assumptions through practical experimentation, and trusting his own judgment when it conflicted with accepted doctrine. The 12 ships sunk during those 3 days in June, and July 1943 represented just the beginning. By war's end, Strafers employing Gunn's tactics and flying aircraft built to his specifications had accounted for hundreds of vessels destroyed and thousands of successful combat missions. But numbers alone failed to capture the program's true significance. Gunn had proven that ingenuity and determination could overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles, that one individual's vision could alter the course of warfare, and that innovation remained possible even within hierarchical military structures resistant to change. Today, Paul Irvin Gunn's name is less familiar than those of famous generals and admirals who commanded armies and fleets. He held no senior command, controlled no vast resources, and made no grand strategic decisions. Yet his contribution to Allied victory in the Pacific was substantial and enduring. Every successful low-level attack mission, every convoy interdicted, every supply line severed, these tactical victories accumulated into strategic advantage, shortening the war and saving lives on both sides. The B-25 gunship that engineers called impossible became one of the Pacific War's most effective weapons because one maverick officer refused to accept conventional limitations. Gunn's legacy endures not just in the aircraft he modified or the tactics he developed, but in the principle he embodied. That innovation springs from questioning assumptions, that expertise comes in many forms, and that courage means pursuing the right answer even when everyone insists you're wrong. In 3 days over the Bismarck Sea, Paul Gunn and his strafers proved that revolutionary change begins with a single person willing to imagine what others cannot see.